What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Horror on Tap. Today I'm going to take a look at horror sequels that took a while to get made. Now, when you have a movie, not just horror movies, but any movie really, that does really well at the box office, there seems to be a pretty big rush from the studio to get a new one pumped out. So I'm going to take a look at a dozen horror films where the sequel took a while to come out. Now, some of these are a few years, some of them are decades. So we're going to take a look at them and find out what caused them to take so long to be made. Let's take a look. First up, we've got 28 Weeks Later, 2007, 5 years after 28 Days Later. Now, from what I could find, the reason for the delay in the creation or the release of 28 Weeks Later was really because the writers from the original, Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, did not return for 28 Weeks Later. So with a whole new set of new writers, it was a complete and total creative reset. They had to start from scratch. So having to do that, you can see how there'd be a bit of a delay in the production. Now, being only 5 years, that's not too bad. But typically with a movie as successful as 28 Days Later was, you would think probably 2-3 years, at the most. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 from 1984, 7 years after the original from 1977. Now for this film, there were a bunch of studio budget cuts and also a lot of changes in the studio direction and the priorities of where they were going with their studio and their films. So that will always take away from the expediency of getting a movie made. Also, Wes Craven himself was really struggling to find money for A Nightmare on Elm Street, which of course is going to go on to be his big cash cow. So looking into all of that, it really just dragged it out for a few more years than it probably should have. Aliens, 1986, 7 years after Alien, 1979. The head of 20th Century Fox, Alan Ladd Jr., had left the company in 1981. He was really big on making Aliens, but the studio had been sold to investors shortly after this time, and they apparently had no interest really in doing an Alien sequel. So when you don't have any interest from your studio heads, executives, whatever, pretty hard to get a movie made, right? So without having any interest from the studio itself, there really was no real way to get the movie made. But then eventually, I think there was some interest from fans and from the studio. So 7 years after the original, they finally got it done. Hannibal, 2001, 10 years after Silence of the Lambs from 1991. Now, this one, pretty easy to figure out why it took so long. There wasn't a sequel. There was no follow-up book yet. Thomas Harris hadn't written it yet. And so, without having the book to do the movie, you can't do the movie. The book from Thomas Harris was actually published in 1999. So as soon as that was released, they really got to work on making the film. Only about 2 years after the book came out was the film released. Of course, there were a bunch of scheduling conflicts for Ridley Scott. He was working on some other movies and some other projects. They had a bunch of casting changes. Of course, Jodie Foster didn't come back. So all those things kind of bundled up. 10 years, really not that bad. But then it was only 2 years from the time of the book to the movie. So really can't complain. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 from 1986, 12 years after the original 1974. There was a lot of creative change in the direction that Tobe Hooper wanted to go compared to where the studio wanted to go. There were a whole mess of rewrites on the script, and of course they really wanted Gunnar Hansen to come back, but evidently he had a contract dispute. He wanted more money and this and that, and apparently they were not going to acquiesce. So all of that being said, it took a dozen years to get the sequel pumped out. An American Werewolf in Paris, 1997, 16 years after An American Werewolf in London from 1981. There were a lot of high expectations on this film, after the success of American Werewolf in London. The director, John Landis, he had a draft for the sequel that apparently was scrapped after the studio rejected it. And then multiple writers were brought in, different drafts. Every single one was completely different from the other. A lot of directors actually were hired and then either left or were fired. So just a lot of going through the motions and things like that. And I think one of the biggest things really was the fact that American Werewolf in London did really well. So there was such high hopes for a sequel that they really couldn't, meet the expectations. So yeah, 16 years between them. Behind the Mask 2, 2027, 21 years after Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon from 2006. Now, as of recording, it's only 2026. Behind the Mask 2 hasn't even come out yet. However, it is being worked on right now. It's in the news that Leslie Vernon will be coming back. Now, the original, it was a low-budget indie film. There was really no sequel originally planned. It was really only brought about by the big cult following that it has. A lot of people wanted to see Leslie Vernon come back. After 21 years between the two, he's finally coming back. Well, now that we're halfway through the list, I think this would be a great time to show you what I'm drinking. Here I've got the New Belgium Voodoo Ranger Sweet Rye Juicy IPA. This thing is 6.5 ABV, so not too strong, but not too light. Actually a pretty good drinker. Goes down pretty smooth. Psycho 2, 1983. 23 years after the original Psycho, 1960. Now, one of the biggest questions I think about making Psycho 2 was really how. Not so much why, but how. The why is easy. Money. There's always going to be money. But with Psycho, it was such a classic. It was such a hit. People call it a masterpiece. Now, how do you make a sequel to a masterpiece? And I think that was really weighing heavily on a lot of people when they wanted to make another Psycho movie. So, 23 years between the time of the original and the time of the sequel, there was a lot to take in. It was a lot to try to follow up. Now, it took a lot of time to get Anthony Perkins on board. Apparently, he did not want to do the film when he was first approached. Took a few tries, and finally he said, "Okay, yeah, I'll do it." And I think he liked the fact that they went in a totally new direction. They didn't just do a rehash of the original, which when I first saw the movie, that's what I expected. I thought it was just going to be essentially the first movie all over again. The subject matter of the film was a little bit of a hot button topic back in the day. I mean, I guess you could say it kind of still is now, but back then especially, it wasn't something you really wanted to be pumping out a whole lot of films on that topic. So I could see why it took him so long to finally get it made. And in all honesty, I would say that it was totally worth the wait. For sure. Beetlejuice, 2024. 36 years after the original from 1988. So evidently, Tim Burton wasn't emotionally ready to make the sequel, which sounds kind of weird, but apparently from what I've read, he wanted more life experience so that he could really relate to what Lydia would have gone through, where her life would be, things of that nature. He really wanted to just get more life experience. He was still pretty young. And so, I mean, 36 years, that's a long time to get some experience. And then, of course, right around that time, Tim Burton went over to do the Batman films, which were huge money makers, massive, especially the first two. And then the success of the Wednesday series on Netflix, apparently that really reinvigorated Burton to finally get out there and make the sequel, Beetlejuice. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 2014. 38 years after The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 1976. Now, this one's a little bit different, because this isn't really a sequel per se, not a direct sequel, something very different. And from what I had heard or read, the term metafictional sequel. Now, it's been a while since I've seen this movie, but I do remember that it was essentially a copycat of The Phantom Killer, which, you know, the original was based very tightly on real life events. I'm sure parts of it were fictionalized for TV, but it's really hard to take a non-fictional film and make a sequel about it that has nothing to do with what happened in real life. This is one of those rare occasions where that actually happens. So after 38 years, you know, somebody finally said, remember that movie, The Town That Dreaded Sundown? Why don't we make a sequel to that? And somebody else went, sure, why not? Honestly, not a bad movie. I wouldn't tell you not to go see it. But one movie I would definitely implore you to go see if you haven't. Dr. Sleep, sequel to The Shining from 1980, 39 years between the two films. So the main reason that Dr. Sleep didn't come out for so long after The Shining was that Stephen King's novel, Dr. Sleep, didn't come out until 2013. So, again, kind of like Hannibal, without having a book to base it on, you really didn't have a movie to make. Apparently also, Warner Brothers really kind of struggled to get the budget, get the financing around for this movie. And after, 39 years and, there's a lot of, lost interest. It's a whole new generation of people who would be watching this film. Now, apparently the success of the It films, they really helped to ignite interest back into The Shining. So the sequel, Dr. Sleep, was finally coming to fruition. And last but certainly not least, Dark Knight of the Scarecrow 2 from 2022. Sequel to Dark Knight of the Scarecrow 1981. 41 years between these films. So the original was a made-for-TV film, and from my understanding, it's actually very difficult to figure out licensing rights and stuff like that when it's a made-for-TV release. A lot more difficult than a theatrical release. So getting the licensing rights for this film, I guess, was very difficult. Took a lot of time. And also, there really wasn't a whole lot of fan interest in the sequel. This wasn't some big movie that everybody loved. It was a movie that had a, small kind of cult following, but even that was real small. I think it was something that once the idea came up to make a sequel, then more people were interested. The director, J.D. Feigelson, I believe his name is, apparently he was impossibly motivated by nostalgia. The film is really more of a personal project for him, not so much a film where there was a huge demand for a sequel. So with all of that, you can see why it would have taken so long for him to do another one. So that's going to do it for me for today. As I often tell you, be sure to like and subscribe down below. Let me know in the comments if you know of any movies that the sequel came out a long time after the original. It could be a horror movie, it could be a non-horror movie. I know there's a lot of them. I just picked out a bunch that I could find. I think a dozen was a good number. I should have made it 13. Fuck me. Anyway, be sure to tune in next time to find out what's on tap. Cheers.